everybody. I'm so excited to be speaking today with Dr. Manon Garcia here in Berlin. We're actually together in her office right now at the moment. Manon has recently published a wonderful book called The Joy of Consent, and it just came out a month ago, and the French version has been around for a couple of years, and so we're going to talk with her a little bit today about this book. Manon, welcome. How you doing?
Thank you very much, Ellie. I'm so happy to have you here. So we're here together because I invited Ellie to talk in my workshop because I think her work on consent is also very good. So, I'm glad to finally talk to you in person about all of this.
Yeah, no, me too. And I want to start by actually picking up on this shared value that we both have, or this shared intuition that we both have, that consent is something worth holding on to, but also something worth reconsidering. So a lot of feminist theorists today are concerned about the way that consent has been employed in a fashion that really doesn't map onto the complexities of sex, and that seems to be one of the starting points for your book on this. So maybe you can tell our viewers a little bit about why you think there needs to be a change in the discourse around consent.
Yeah, so thank you very much. Yeah, of course. So I think, first of all, there's a problem with consent as we understand it, especially in the Anglophone world. That we have what I call, and what is widely called, a liberal understanding of consent, where we're kind of pretending that the people who consent to sex are kind of isolated from society in a vat, the two of them, that they already know what they like sexually, what they want to do, that there's no social pressure on them to do anything, and that they can agree or disagree to have sex, and that what sex means is already understood. And so we have this sort of vision of consent as a sort of QR code, like you scan it and you're good to go. And the question that feminist theorists raise is also like, go where?
Yeah.
And like that there's also in this idea of consent, this assumption that it's man who's gonna, so that first that it's going to be heterosexual, and second that it's man who proposes to the woman something sexual, and that what it is to be a woman is to agree or disagree, so consent or non-consent to what men are offering you sexually. And I think, of course, like this is very problematic because there are all these assumptions that are built into it. One is that men always want sex. Another one is that women never want sex. You know, it's the whole idea of a battle of the sexes where men want sex, women want love, and we do a sort of compromise, and that sex is this heterosexual thing where a penis enters a vagina and where it ends. So there are so many sexist views that are nested in consent. And so there are very good reasons for feminists to be worried about this. But consent has played an enormous role in recognizing other forms of sexuality than reproductive, heteronormative sex, monogamous sex. So I think it's very important to remind ourselves that the concept of consent was crucial in making people understand that gay sex was okay, that lesbian sex was okay, that BDSM can be okay. And so it played an emancipatory role. So it's good that we moved on from sex is normal or abnormal towards what matters is if it's consented. So we have this idea that it played a liberatory role. But I think we have also another idea about consent, that when we consent, we do more than just formally agreeing to something, that we say something about who we are and we share something with someone else. And so what I explain in the book is that I think there are two historical lineages of consent. There's one that is liberal, but another one that is Kantian, in which consent is an expression of our autonomy and our dignity, and in which it's a crucial part of an expressing our freedom. And so I think that's why we kind of want to hold on to it. And so what the sort of departure point of my book is to say, okay, like, yeah, consent sucks, but I also think I really don't want to just give up on this because there's something I truly believe is important about it.
That's great. And I know one of the things that you're doing here, and I'm also interested in doing in some of my work, is thinking about how we can actually go back to the Latin origin of consent as consentire, which means feeling with, and think through what that might mean for reconceptualizing consent away from this liberal model. But you also just mentioned in your answer that you're thinking about consent in an almost Kantian way in terms of autonomy. And it strikes me that tradition of Immanuel Kant's kind of autonomy-based ethics, where there's an emphasis on universalizing maxims, it doesn't necessarily at first glance seem to be very feeling-based. And so, and the book is called The Joy of Consent. So how are you thinking about those things together? Autonomy and feeling with, the juicier and the more kind of abstract dimensions.
So, of course, as some of you may know, but not all of you, Kant was notoriously a bit dry about love issues.
Yeah, what's the sex? Doesn't he have this horrible quote about sex as being like a lemon's being sucked dry?
Yeah, but he also has this whole thing about the fact that that sex is a form of objectification that is impermissible, and that therefore like you can't masturbate because that's using yourself as an object, and so it's the meaning for yourself, and you can't have sex with other people because you're using them as objects. And so there's this fiction that is marriage that he understands as a contract to exchange each other's bodies and to be allowed to use each other's bodies as objects, but it's okay because you're married. and you're like, yeah, thank you, Emmanuel, that sounds very sexy. But I'm not so much interested in what he says about marriage as in what he says in the groundworks of the metaphysics of morals, where he says one of the formulations of the categorical imperative is to say that you should not treat other people solely as means, but also as ends. So what he means by ends is as the kind of beings that have the ability to set goals for themselves and to pursue these goals freely. And so a lot of people have understood this as meaning you should treat people as ends, and it's wrong to treat them as means. And even Kant seems to have understood it like that. But what I find interesting, and Martha Nussbaum before me, is that he says you can't treat them solely as means. And I think precisely what happens in good sex is that we treat people as means, we treat them as objects for our pleasures, but also as ends, and as people looking for specific things happening in sex, and for specific, what I call in my book, following sociologists, sexual projects. And so I think a crucial part of what good sex is to acknowledge the fact that it is joint agency. So instead of understanding sex as something that someone does to someone else, understanding sex as a question of how two people do something together to feel together. And what are the moral implications of understanding sex that way. Because I think one thing that really bothers me and puzzles me is that we know a lot of these stories of guys who started treating women really badly after they had sex with them, or who were very good friends with women and started having sex with them, and from there on treated them like shit. With this, and so what I find interesting in this is that there seems to be this idea that politeness stops when you start having sex with each other. And of course, like, it doesn't sound very sexy to say, oh, we should be polite about sex. But actually, I think it's very sexy, first of all. And also, I think we're touching here a very important question about what is the link between morality and sex. And that a crucial problem is that people have a tendency to think that sex is a place where morality doesn't matter. And so, of course, we can say, well, the problem of a moral evaluation of sex is that we know how moralism has been playing there, of saying like this is abnormal sex, this is perversion, etc. That like religion has played a big role, etc. And so we have good reasons to be very wary of applying morals to sex. But it's also very bizarre to not apply moral to sex, because
like, we have morality in all these areas except sex.
Yeah, like suddenly there's this sort of idea of like, oh yeah, about this, we're animals.
Yeah.
And so for me, as a French person, it's always very perplexing to see these very important cultural critiques that are, you know, all about opera and literature and this and that, and who deeply believe in the importance of language, of civilization, who say, oh no, we can't talk about sex. and sex is like, if you talk about sex, it's going to be disgusting, and it's going to be weird, etc. And I think we need to think about why we give this exceptional status to sex, and why we think that the rules of politeness and of basic humanity don't hold in the realms of sex. And why we think that where we think language makes our life more civilized, it wouldn't apply in sex. So a good example that I have about this is that I think these cultural critiques in France, they would never go to a 3 Michelin star restaurant alone. Why? Because we all know that when you eat an extremely good meal, part of what makes it extremely good is to talk to the person you share it with about how it feels. That you're like, oh, look at this texture. Oh, how do you think they did this? And that you want to talk about the cuisine, and that it makes your pleasure even bigger. If some of you know French people or Italians, like, we're crazy in that regard. Like, we can talk about a meal like for days before, we can talk about it during, and then for days after. Or like, I still have meals that I think about and that I mention, oh, you remember how these zucchini were cooked, etc. And so why is it that with sex, if we were to talk about our pleasure, it would destroy the pleasure? I think it's just not true. It's rather the opposite. And so one of my claims in the book is that we're illiterate about sex. We don't know, we don't have the vocabulary because of this sort of, this is the black continent, this is the obscurity of eros, etc. We don't know how to talk about our body parts, to talk about what we want sexually, to talk about our sexual, so our sexual projects, the reasons we have to have sex, and that we need to recognize that it's not just out of love or out of pleasure that we have sex. Because part of doing moral philosophy about sex is recognizing that we have many reasons to have sex that are not always just pleasure and desire, and that feeling together can also be like something like rubbing our backs or something like that, that we need to recognize that there is morally good sex that is physically not very exciting. Like a good example of that is when people try to procreate, you know, like you want to have a kid, it's been really hard, and you've been trying for months, etc. So you know there are these 2 or 3 days in the month where it's like, honey, we need to get going. You know? And so it's very rare that in those days you're gonna be like having the sex of your life, etc. You need to do it. But you want to do it because you want the project that is behind and the goal that is behind. And so this can be perfectly morally good sex, but and it doesn't have to be like the best orgasm you've ever had.
There's like a zillion places I want to take this conversation right now, but as you mentioned before, I have to give a talk right after this, so maybe I'll ask you one more question and then invite our viewers to check out your book on their own for more. So I'm curious about how you're seeing the dimension of morality and the dimension of pleasure in tandem, because it seems to me that it sounds as though you really want to tie them together in a certain sense, and at the same time, some other sexual ethicists have been concerned about making it seem like those two are the same thing, because, for instance, we know that sometimes people can feel pleasure during experiences of sexual violation where there's an immoral act that's being done, but pleasure coexists. And so how are you seeing the joy of consent as an expression of moral sex perhaps, but then also maybe not wanting to conflate those two entirely.
So first of all, I haven't chosen the title.
Okay, I was gonna ask because it's different. You have the French one.
So this is the French one. So the French one was called The Conversation of the Sexes, A Philosophy of Consent.
Mm-hmm.
And my American publisher thought it was not really sexy.
So you wrote it in French and then you translated it yourself into English, but they chose.
So I didn't really even translate it. I wrote an English version.
Oh yeah, okay.
So I changed some things, etc.
Yeah.
And so initially they wanted to call it The Sexiness of Consent. And I was like, no, I'm not going there.
Yeah.
And so they offered The Joy of Consent. And I was more happy with it because I think for a lot of Americans there's the memory of The Joy of Sex.
Yes,
which
definitely.
was a guide of good sex. But
that's what it
also,
reads to me, yeah.
Also The Joy of Cooking. And I think it's very important.
Yeah.
Because there's something about like cooking and sex, I think, well, it might be my French side, but I think there's something about what it is to prepare something good, like how you think afterwards, because one of the big claims I have is that we also need to think about post-sex consent, like how we think about what we wanted during the sex and is it really what happened.
Yeah.
And so I think in cuisine there's this about like how you think afterwards, like you had a good gross fast food and like an hour later you feel really gross, and we need to recognize that it's part of the pleasure, that sometimes how you feel about your pleasure later on is a sign of how moral you think it was, maybe.
That's great.
Great. So there's that. So I didn't choose the title, but one of the things I'm trying to do in the book is argue that we should ask two different questions in terms of moral philosophy about sex. One is the question that everyone asks, which is what is permissible and impermissible. Yeah. So the right and wrong of sex, and that consent might be doing a good enough job, and this is almost a legal question, like what should we allow as sexual relations, but that it's a question of like what philosophers call negative freedoms, the right to not be violated, but that because we've been focusing on this because men rape women, kids, other men all the time, we've been focusing on sexual violence and sexual violations. But that there's a very important question that we should not leave only to Christian sexual ethics, that is good and bad sex. So there's right and wrong, and there's good and bad. And that we need to recognize that what is morally good sex has to be permissible, but permissibility is not enough. Yeah. Like and so I think this solves a lot of intuitions that we have about cases where we're like, well, okay, this was consented, but it really sucked, and all the ways we can think better about the gray zone, etc. in saying, okay, so, but this good and bad, the reason why we're struggling with it is because we tend to think that it means pleasurable or non-pleasurable. And actually, I don't think there can be really displeasurable good sex. So I think pleasure has to be, so it can't be, you couldn't say, oh, this was morally good sex, although I'm really disgusted with this person. Like there's something where it needs to be satisfactory enough. It doesn't need to be extremely pleasurable, but sex where you wouldn't feel anything, it's not great, even morally. But I think we need to recognize that there can be impermissible sex that is pleasurable, bad sex that is pleasurable, and good sex that is not so pleasurable. And that pleasure is not a good for analysis of what good sex is.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Garcia, for speaking with me about this. You also have your first book, We Are Not Born Submissive, up here, which I have reviewed both professionally and also on TikTok. Definitely recommend that one as well. And check out The Joy of Consent.
Thank you very much.